You know that feeling, right? You absolutely love a song or a film or a book, and then you find out something pretty troubling about the person who made it. It's such a weird, confusing feeling. It basically throws you into this moral maze where you have to ask, how do we, or, should we, separate incredible art from its flawed creator? We're going to unpack that because it's a question that just doesn't go away.
So, here's our game plan. First, we'll tackle the main dilemma, brilliance versus morality. Then, we'll look at 3 different philosophical tools you can use to judge art. We're going to ask if our feelings about fiction should play by different rules. Then we'll apply all these ideas to a famous case study, and we'll wrap up with a simple framework that you can use anytime.
All right, let's dive into our first section, the massive clash between artistic brilliance and morality, and how this all plays out in the real world. This really is the heart of the matter. Can something be a masterpiece and a moral minefield at the exact same time? And there's no easy answer here, right? It's a tension that forces us to figure out what we value more, the aesthetic genius or the ethical behavior behind it, and what happens when the art itself seems to be winking at the artist's own controversies.
And that brings us to a perfect and perfectly complicated example, Woody Allen's 1979 classic Manhattan. Look, it's considered a cinematic masterpiece, a beautiful black and white love letter to New York City. But it's also about a 42-year-old man dating a 17-year-old high school student. And that central plot point has become pretty much impossible to separate from the real-life controversies that have surrounded Allen for decades.
And believe me, the debate is fierce. This quote is from Stacey Nelkin, who actually dated Woody Allen as a teenager right around the time Manhattan was being made. Her passionate defense of him years later just goes to show how incredibly polarized this whole conversation is. This isn't just some abstract philosophical debate. We're talking about real people with very, very deep personal stakes. So how on earth are we supposed to navigate something this charged? Well, let's move on and see what philosophy has to offer. It actually gives us a pretty handy toolkit with 3 completely different ways to think about this. First up, we have autonomism. The easiest way to think about this is art for art's sake. Someone who takes this view would say, hey, let's judge the film on its own merits. The cinematography is gorgeous, the writing is sharp, the music is perfect. The artist's life, the morality of the story, that's a totally separate conversation. The aesthetic value is autonomous, it stands alone. Then, on the complete opposite end, you have moralism. This view says no way, you absolutely cannot separate them. For a moralist, a moral flaw is an aesthetic flaw. They might say that if Manhattan is trying to make us feel okay about a really questionable relationship, then it fails as a piece of art. The moral defect actually makes it less beautiful, less successful. And then you've got the real curveball, immoralism. This idea is pretty counterintuitive, but it suggests that sometimes a work's moral defect can actually make it more valuable. By forcing us to sit with a really uncomfortable perspective, the art challenges us. It deepens our understanding, it makes us think. In other words, it's powerful because it's problematic. Okay, so just to recap real quick. For the autonomist, the moral flaw is totally irrelevant to the art. For the moralist, that flaw is a defect that absolutely hurts the art. And for the immoralist, that same flaw can actually make the art better by messing with our heads. And I'm willing to bet you've probably felt all 3 of these at some point, even if you didn't have the fancy names for them. All right, now we're going to go one level deeper. This next section introduces a concept that really puts our own feelings, our own emotional responses under the microscope. I know, this sounds super academic, but the idea behind it is actually pretty simple. It's this quiet assumption that our feelings about fiction should basically play by the same rules as our feelings about reality. So if something is wrong in real life, this idea says it should also feel wrong when we watch it in a movie. The rules are symmetrical. But hang on, is that really true? I mean, think about it. Do you enjoy dark comedies? Do you root for the anti-hero in a TV show? We constantly engage with ideas in fiction that we would find totally horrifying in real life. And that's the big challenge to this whole idea. Maybe the rules really are just different when you're inside a story. And this brings us to a really powerful distinction. On one side, you have a fictional ethical defect. That's when a work simply shows us or explores an immoral point of view. The problem is safely quarantined inside the story. But on the other side, you have an actual ethical defect. This is when a work seems to be endorsing that immoral view, almost trying to export it into the real world by asking us to accept it as true. Okay, so now that we're armed with this new tool, this difference between exploration and endorsement,
Let's circle all the way back to our Woody Allen case study and see how it helps us think about the problem.
You know, context is key. When you look at this timeline, you realize this movie wasn't made in a vacuum. The subject of the art is directly mirroring something happening in the artist's real life around the same time. And that context, the stuff from outside the film, makes it so much harder to treat the story's moral questions as purely theoretical. And the film itself is completely aware of the taboo it's playing with. The main character, played by Allen, literally voices the awkwardness of the situation out loud. So the movie isn't ignoring the problem, it's putting it right out there, front and center, for the audience to grapple with. So this leads us to the big question. Is Manhattan just exploring a taboo, a fictional defect that stays safely inside the story? Or, when you factor in the real-life context, does it start to feel like an endorsement, an actual defect, that's trying to normalize this kind of behavior in our world? Now, this framework doesn't give us the answer, but it gives us a much better question to ask.
Okay, let's bring all this home. Let's put it all together into a clear framework that you can use for any piece of problematic art you come across.
Here it is, just 3 simple steps. First, identify. Get really clear on what the specific moral issue is. Step 2, position. Check in with yourself. Are you looking at this through an autonomous lens, a moralist one, or an immoralist one? And finally, step 3, analyze. Use that key distinction we talked about. Is this work just exploring the problem, or is it actually endorsing it? Ultimately, the goal here isn't to get some universal, final verdict on every piece of art. It's just about having the tools to make a more thoughtful, more nuanced judgment for yourself. So the next time you run into a masterpiece that just makes you feel uneasy, you can ask yourself the question, is this a fictional defect, safely explored inside the art, or is it an actual defect, trying to get out into the world? And how you answer that, that'll change everything.